This is the story of the most famous family in the world. The longest living, still working monarchy. Its kings and queens. Its wise rulers and its foolish ones. Its beautiful princesses and their tragic lives. The queens who grew stronger with age. And dedicated princes. And young men who were always straight and true. The story of monarchy in peril and monarchy redeemed. The story of the Windsors. George V began the Windsor dynasty when he changed the royal name. His son, Edward VIII, abandoned the throne after less than a year and left his younger brother, George VI, to pick up the pieces. He did it so well that his daughter, Princess Elizabeth, came to the throne perfectly prepared for what would be the longest reign of the House of Windsor. It began sooner than expected. In February 1952, Princess Elizabeth was touring Kenya with her husband, Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. They were deputizing for the king, who was recovering from illness. The princess did not yet know that back in England, her father had died in his sleep, and that even as Prime Minister Winston Churchill instructed his cabinet on the next move, Elizabeth had already been proclaimed the new monarch.
Before the age-old tower the guns speak, Elizabeth is Queen. The name that once before spelled glory for Britain.
Beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless the royal Princess Elizabeth II with long and happy years to reign over us. Given at St. James's Palace this 6th day of February in the year of our Lord, 1952.
The fourth monarch in the Windsor line descended from an aircraft to be greeted as Queen Elizabeth II.
The Princess Elizabeth we knew and loved returns amongst us as our queen. The little girl we knew has become Queen Elizabeth. The love we gave her has become allegiance.
Her call to the throne had come tragically sooner than she would have wished, but the young queen would step into her historic role with calm authority. After the ordeal of her father's funeral, the public saw a different Elizabeth, a woman with an inner radiance, both monarch and mother, who'd become the most loved and admired Windsor of them all. Her grandmother, Queen Mary, who had taught her so much about royal poise and dignity, wanted above all to see Elizabeth crowned. But Mary died at 85, just 3 months before the coronation. Her last wish was that the coronation should not be postponed.
Queen Mary is dead. This great lady of Britain, whose life spanned 6 reigns. Through the streets of the capital which she loved, the procession passes the stands built for Coronation Day. Behind the cortege march the 4 dukes, Edinburgh, Windsor, Gloucester, and Kent. 2 of her sons, a grandson, and the husband of her granddaughter, our queen. And then to pay their own personal tributes to the great lady now at rest, come the ordinary people. In their thousands they gather, in a queue a mile long. The people of London, the people of her country.
Queen Mary was gone, but not forgotten. Her husband, who had died 17 years earlier, had asked on his deathbed that his favorite yacht, Britannia, be sent to the bottom of the sea. But now the new queen would honor her grandfather's memory by reviving the name.
I name this ship Britannia. I wish success to her and to all who sail in her.
Her Majesty releases the traditional bottle, not of champagne this time, but of Empire wine.
What memories the new ship would create. And 50 years later, in 2002, when Queen Elizabeth celebrated her Golden Jubilee as monarch in a joyous rush of love from her subjects, how she must have recalled memories of her own long reign and her own remarkable life as head of the Windsor dynasty. How the memories, spread over 76 years, must have revolved in the Queen's mind.
Sweet, sweet memories you gave me. You can't beat the memories you gave me. Sweet, sweet memories you gave
made of this.
You can't beat the memories you gave me.
Fold in lightly with a dream.
You can't beat the memories you gave me.
One girl, one boy, some grief, some joy. Memories are made of this. With his blessings from above, serve it generously above. One man, one wife, one love, through life, memories are made of this. Memories are made of this.
Her first powerful memory must have been the time Elizabeth saw her father crowned king and her mother crowned queen on that unforgettable day in 1937. She was only 11 then and had just begun to realize her royal destiny. Whilst her father would die tragically young, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, would live to 100 and beyond, and see the expanding House of Windsor grow well into the 5th generation. Most of all, she'd remember the coronation that changed her life forever. As she set out through the rain showers in that centuries-old coach, she knew that everything she did from this moment would be scrutinized by millions. The ceremony was being televised for the first time. The eyes of the world were upon her. Westminster Abbey was filled with aristocrats and dignitaries from all over the world. Watched over by her mother and her sister Margaret, the young queen looked pale but poised. Before the crowning moment, there was the oath to her people, a commitment to lifelong service.
I solemnly promise so to do.
There followed a ceremony older than history and too sacred to be filmed. As Zadok the priest anointed Solomon with the oil of gladness, so too the queen was blessed and consecrated before God.
O God, the crown of the faithful, bless, we beseech thee, this crown, and so sanctify thy servant Elizabeth, upon whose head this day thou dost place it for a sign of royal majesty.
Then the moment came when she accepted the full weight of that ancient crown on her youthful head. Now it would be her husband's turn to pay homage to the woman who was both his wife and his sovereign.
I, Philip, will become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship. In faith and truth I will bear unto you, to live and die against all manner of folk, so help me God.
By decree, the royal dynasty would remain named Windsor, not changing to Philip's family name of Mountbatten. As the gold coach headed back to the palace, Queen Elizabeth II was able to relax at last. As exuberant crowds clamored outside Buckingham Palace, the Queen, now wearing the lighter imperial state crown, emerged with her bridal party. The Queen didn't know it yet, but her sister, Princess Margaret, had been up to her romantic tricks. She would soon be headline news in the tabloids. As the coronation finished, the press spotted Margaret being rather intimate with her father's equerry, Peter Townsend. Rumours about their affair appeared to have been confirmed. It had started during the royal tour of South Africa in 1947, when journalists had noticed that 16-year-old Margaret had a crush on this older man. In 1953, the couple would be separated, with Townsend being sent abroad. By 1955, Margaret had reached 25, the age when she could choose whom she married. The romance had turned into a controversy.
Officially, he is the British Air Attaché in Brussels, Group Captain Peter Woolridge Townsend, CVO, DSO, DFC and Bar, former equerry to Her Majesty. Now he comes home, and at once he is front page news, because for the first time in 2 years, Princess Margaret is in London too. Princess Margaret, third in line for the throne of Britain, now 25 and legally in control of her own destiny.
The press ambushed Townsend as he left Clarence House, where Margaret was staying with her mother. Townsend was the soul of discretion. Not by a word or a gesture did he reveal his heartbreak. It would be announced later that day that Princess Margaret had put duty before love. Later that night in London, a glittering parade of film stars were waiting the arrival of the Queen for the Royal Command film performance, an occasion notable for the absence of Princess Margaret, who was nursing a broken heart.
The stars are gathered, and it's time for the Queen to arrive. For the first time for many years, her sister Princess Margaret is not with her. But she is in everyone's thoughts, for it is less than an hour since her long-awaited statement was issued from Clarence House.
The Queen, privately unhappy for her grieving sister, was a model of serene grace. Having chosen a life of royal duty, Margaret seemed to have mended her broken heart. She'd never looked more ravishingly lovely as she toured the West Indies, which had just formed itself into a federation. She was in vivacious form when she gave a speech in Jamaica.
An example of how well-travelled I'm becoming is that when people now talk to me of Scarborough, my mind turns less naturally to the North Riding than to Tobago. Today, the West Indies looks forward to becoming a fully self-governing member of the Commonwealth.
Early in her reign, the Queen made it clear that she believed passionately in the new British Commonwealth, that community of democratic nations which had replaced the old empire. To keep this noble ideal alive, she and her husband travelled the world for months at a time. In the spring of 1954, they ended a Commonwealth tour at the Rock of Gibraltar, where the small colony gave them a tumultuous reception. The royal children, Charles and Anne, had sailed from England to see their parents for the first time in 6 months. Now, the whole family were eager to meet Gibraltar's most famous residents, the legendary apes. When the Queen joined them, the camera recorded a remarkable incident, Her Majesty gently rebuking an ape for his bad manners. That was just the beginning of the Queen's endless travelling, going east or west, north or south, a year-on-year itinerary promoting her favourite cause, the Commonwealth. The Duke of Edinburgh, who'd sometimes felt he was fated to be little more than the Queen's public escort, made a world tour of his own in the mid-50s, and his wife saw him off as he flew away on a 4-month journey as an international ambassador. Philip sailed on the royal yacht for a long voyage into the South Atlantic ice, where he exchanged pleasantries with some friendly penguins on Gough Island, a remote British territory. There'd been some muttering about Philip's long absence, but on his return, he delivered an impassioned speech on the need to keep the Commonwealth ideal alive.
It is the Duke's first big public engagement since the Queen conferred on him the title of the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh.
This Commonwealth, of which every member is so proud, came into existence because people made sacrifices and offered their service to it. Now it has been handed to us, and if we don't make sacrifices for it, we shall have nothing to hand on to those who come after us. and the world will have lost something of much greater value than just a grand conception.
While the Queen devoted herself to affairs of state, Prince Philip took charge of their children's education. So Prince Charles, who was now 9, found himself a new boy at the same prep school his father had attended. He would be the first heir to the throne to be educated away from home. That nervous smile was appropriate. He would not be happy here. Later, Charles was sent to a Scottish boarding school, Gordonstoun, and yes, Prince Philip had been a pupil there too, where the senior boys were so democratic that they'd happily tease an heir to the throne. However, when Princess Anne, Charles's young sister, was placed at a posh girls' school called Benenden, she took it all in her self-confident stride. When Charles turned 11, he'd be rather startled to find himself with a much younger baby brother. Indeed, the arrival of Prince Andrew startled everyone. Elizabeth and Philip had silenced rumours of a cooling off in their marriage by starting a second family 10 years after the birth of Princess Anne. Meanwhile, Princess Margaret was getting a reputation as a good-time girl. So the Queen Mother was delighted when, at the age of 29, Margaret announced her engagement to Anthony Armstrong Jones. What's more, her bridegroom was a professional photographer with a slightly racy background. A perfect match, people said, although class prejudice, still a factor in 1960, had thinned the ranks of European royals attending the wedding. Many of them stayed away because Margaret was marrying a commoner. Her sister, the Queen, would change that by making him Lord Snowdon. Through the 60s, the Windsor family continued to grow. In 1964, the Queen produced her 4th child and 3rd son. The baby, Prince Edward, was shown off to the public after a trooping of the colour ceremony. This moment, with the whole family together, old and new, was one of the most memorable days of Queen Elizabeth's reign. Her reign had deepened people's respect for monarchy, and her decision in her mid-30s to bring 2 more royal children into the world had won her admiration as head of a model happy family. Not long after the Queen's happiest day, she had one of her saddest, the death of the great statesman and her dear friend, Winston Churchill. The sense of loss was felt by the whole nation. The Queen herself ordered that Sir Winston be given the unique honour, for a commoner, of a state funeral. And the nation did him proud, with a Queen leading the mourners into St. Paul's Cathedral.
It is perhaps without precedent for the sovereign to attend a funeral service of a commoner. But for such a commoner, what is precedent?
As the great man's coffin passed, the Queen would have recalled the night when he resigned from office, shortly after his 80th birthday, when she and Philip had joined him for dinner in Downing Street. How the old man proudly wore his Knight of the Garter gaiters, and how she must have sensed the ghosts of history stirring in the air.
At the tower, a salute of 19 guns. The wharf cranes bow in salute.
There were ghosts in the Houses of Parliament, where the Queen presided for just one day every year over the opening of State Parliament. Famous kings had proceeded down these same aisles. Renowned statesmen had thundered their speeches across those crowded benches.
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands this honourable House to attend Her Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
The Queen had always loved formality, custom and ritual, and here she had all 3.
My lords and members of the House of Commons, my government, in cooperation with the other members of the Commonwealth and with our allies, will continue to work for peace and security in all parts of the world. A particular concern of my ministers will be to use all available means to achieve a negotiated settlement of the conflict in Vietnam.
It was a day in 1967 when the whole royal family turned up to honor the life of Queen Mary. But the ghosts at the banquet were that notorious couple, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. The memorial plaque to Queen Mary barely got a look in. All eyes were on the former King Edward VIII and his formidable wife, Wallis. The Queen Mother pretended they simply weren't there. She'd never forgiven Edward for abandoning the throne and putting such a burden on her husband, Bertie. She believed it had hastened his death. The Queen, who'd been just 10 when it happened, came from a different generation. She greeted them both with genuine warmth. For her, the feud was over. 32 years had passed since Edward's abdication, but he and his wife still drew the crowds. After this appearance, they both talked about the king that Edward might have been.
I think he was ahead of his time. I think he had lots of pep, and I think he was very much ahead of his time. I think he wanted to establish things that were a little not ready for them, really, perhaps.
Not ready for it, no. But if there was anything new came along, I always want to try it out, always.
I thought he was very interested in everything that was going on in the people, and made a lot of trips, and I thought that was very interesting. Do not only ceremonials, but to go down among the people, which to me as an American is what I'm used to people doing, and I thought that was very clever.
The Queen had shown that although she loved tradition, she was happy to reward modern innovators too. So she must have been startled by the Conservative backlash when she made 4 cheeky youngsters from Liverpool members of the British Empire. They'd become an overnight rock and roll sensation and had earned a fortune for Britain. Undismayed by the fuss, the Beatles brandished their medals, while hordes of young girls screamed their approval. The Beatles would be a driving force in the Cultural Revolution that was about to transform Britain in what became known as the swinging 60s.
Here comes the equestrian statue, prancing up and down the square. Little old ladies stop and say, well, I declare. Here comes the equestrian statue, prancing up and down the square. Little old ladies stop and say, well, I declare. It's a sight to bring you joy, you feel so gay.
Meanwhile, a prince who hadn't yet discovered the Cultural Revolution had been given a remarkable 21st birthday present by his mother, the Queen.
It is a very impressive ceremony. I know perhaps some people would think that it is rather anachronistic and out of place in this world, which is perhaps somewhat cynical. But I think it can mean quite a lot if one goes about it in the right way. The British, on the whole, tend to do these sort of ceremonies rather well.
In 1969, the spectacular investiture of Charles as Prince of Wales was celebrated in a ceremony that echoed medieval rituals, although much of it was specially designed for the TV cameras. However manufactured the ceremony, the Queen's dignity and Charles's sincerity gave the investiture a touch of magic.
I, Charles, Prince of Wales, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship, and faith and truth I will bear unto thee, to live and die against all manner of folks.
The heir to the throne had come of age, and would now be given important royal duties. Like his father, he'd also become an accomplished polo player. It was at a polo match that he first met a young woman called Camilla Shand, who would be his first real love. But he would drift away from her and live to regret it. Now, in his mid-20s, Charles was the world's most eligible bachelor, and wherever he went as a lone prince, beautiful women kissed him. All this time, Charles's sister, Princess Anne, had been emerging as an event rider of the finest class. In 1972, her form won her selection for the British Olympic team. There'd been gossip for some time that Anne and fellow equestrian Mark Phillips were lovers, and in 1973, the couple announced their engagement. Their delight in each other's company would not last. Anne's aunt, Princess Margaret, whose marriage had already faltered, but who thought she was safe from prying eyes on her Caribbean island, was hunted down by the paparazzi. They photographed her with her young lover, a posh gardener called Roddy Llewellyn. The scandalous headlines were seen around the world. Margaret's husband, Lord Snowdon, who was in Australia at the time, called a press conference in Sydney and made a painful and emotional statement.
I'm naturally desperately sad in every way that this had to happen. And I would just like to express with the utmost humility my love, admiration, and respect I will always have for her sister, her mother, and indeed her entire family.
Margaret never recovered her poise. She smoked incessantly, despite her damaged lungs, and would drift into an accident-prone old age. That royal scandal, the first of its kind since Edward VIII ran off with Wallis, had happened in the mid-1970s, though it didn't affect the Queen's popularity, which was actually boosted by her serene performance in the USA, where she saluted the American people on the occasion of the country's own 200th birthday.
Many of those immigrants even believed that the streets of New York were paved with gold. But if there is no gold on the streets, this is preeminently a city of enterprise, quality, and achievements. And I am honored to receive its citizenship and thank you warmly for it.
The following year, 1977, was the 25th anniversary of the Queen's accession to the throne, and there were months of heartfelt Silver Jubilee celebrations throughout Britain. But when the Jubilee party ended, Britons were reminded of political unrest and rioting in the streets. And there was the constant threat of the IRA, which one terrible day would strike at the very heart of the House of Windsor. Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Queen's cousin and war hero, had played a matchmaking role in the courtship of the then Princess Elizabeth by his nephew, Prince Philip. And now, Lord Louis's launch had been blown to pieces by IRA terrorists.
They that go down to the sea in ships and occupy their business in great waters, these men see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep.
Prince Charles was shattered by his loss. Lord Louis had been his mentor, advisor, and personal hero. Charles would need someone else in his life. He needed a wife, a young, pretty one like this demure 19-year-old of impeccable background, Lady Diana Spencer. Diana's first interview was a disaster. She'd get much better at them, especially when she learned to use her sex appeal.
We thought it was going to be announced on his 32nd birthday, but there wasn't. Have you any comment to make about that?
Lady Di.
No comment all round. It's work now, okay?
The couple's engagement was described as the world's worst kept secret. So when it finally became official, the press were already waiting with their predictable questions, such as when had Charles proposed?
Well, I asked Diana before she went to Australia, 2-3 days before, because I thought it'd be a good idea that, apart from anything else, if she went to Australia, she could then think about it, and if she didn't like the idea, she could say she didn't, or if she did, she could say that. But in fact, you actually said...
Yes, quite promptly.
Before you went to Australia?
Yes.
It should have been a happy day. Charles playing polo and his young fiancée admiring from the sideline. But suddenly Diana burst into tears and had to be escorted home by friends. Too much attention from the media, people said. It all overwhelmed her. Not long after, Diana would be in tears again as she bade Charles farewell on a trip to Australia. Her tears were read as sadness at being separated from her true love. In fact, she had sensed that Charles had another woman in his life. The consequences of Diana's unhappiness would haunt the lives of every Windsor in the years to come. Meanwhile, people all over Britain were in a fever of excitement over the forthcoming wedding. At one school, children actually acted out the wedding in advance. Whatever private tension she felt, Diana stepped out of the royal coach on the 29th of July 1981, a vision in a wondrous wedding dress. Her train was so long, it took minutes to straighten out. After the exchange of vows, as the bridal couple emerged from St. Paul's Cathedral, the immensity of the whole spectacle must have stunned them. Something like 1 million people lining the route to the palace, more than 1 billion watching on live television around the world. The pressure on the couple was relentless. Even on their honeymoon, Charles and Diana had to pose for 200 photographers in the middle of a Scottish glen, just a stroll away from Balmoral Castle. And of course, they had to cope with some very personal questions.
Have you cooked a breakfast yet?
2 years on, Charles and Diana had performed that most important royal duty and produced another heir to the Windsor line. They called the new prince William, and the reception the baby received from the crowds in the street was ecstatic.
Oh, it's wonderful, absolutely fabulous. Oh, great. She was beautiful. Oh, it's still fantastic to talk about, really, isn't it?
Oh, I cried. I couldn't help it.
You cried?
I did, yeah.
Before long, Charles and Diana set off on a royal tour of Australia, and there were cries of approval as the baby was carried from the plane. He was the first royal baby ever to be taken on tour. It had been Diana's idea. And in fact, Diana was proving a bigger draw on her first trip than Charles himself. Even William's favourite toy became the subject of press interest.
You got a plastic whale that throws things out the top, little balls.
In 1985, the couple would have a second son, who'd be christened Henry, but be known to all as Harry. Meanwhile, Charles's brother, the Falklands veteran Prince Andrew, had fallen in love with a young career woman called Sarah Ferguson. Fergie, as everyone knew her, found the manic press attention bewildering, but Diana helped her through the traffic. Yet the new girl was clearly full of boisterous self-confidence. She had clearly charmed Andrew, but would she be discreet enough to avoid the media's celebrity traps? For the moment, it was all about her ruby ring and a wedding date later in the year.
We were made to sit next door to each other at lunch at Ascot.
Yes, and you made me eat chocolate profiteroles, which I didn't want to eat at all.
I then didn't have them, so I got hit.
Do you have any advice, sir, for your brother following you into marriage?
Dream of giving advice.
Do you think it's about time he settled down, sir?
Do you?
I'm asking you.
It's a very difficult question.
His reputation
He obviously
precedes him.
feels it's time he settled.
Do you think it will
But
clip his wings,
reputation
sir?
precedes him, sir.
What reputation?
Do you think it will
How
clip
dare
his
you
wings?
impugn my brother's
I'm
honour?
not impugning him, it's what I said.
The Duchess of York, as she became, looked sensational on her wedding day. She was a model of formal grace, even remembering to curtsy prettily to the Queen. After the ceremony, as the couple rode away, the Queen ran after their coach in an untypical bout of merriment. She seemed to be delighted by the match, and for all the Windsors, it was a day to remember. Fergie gave the first hint that she might become a runaway truck when, on a royal skiing holiday, she and Diana playfully tried to shove each other out of the press lineup. Charles was not amused. There is a difference when someone brought up as a royal meets other royals. Like King Juan Carlos of Spain, here bestowing formal royal kisses on the British royal family, as he and his wife, Queen Sophia, enter Windsor Castle for a state banquet in their honor. This, in fact, was more like a family reunion, for the king is also descended from Queen Victoria. Juan Carlos was an example of a monarch restored to a democratic country after 30 years of despotism, who still played by the royal rules. As the wider Windsor dynasty entered the 1990s, it would become only too clear that some of the newer members of the royal family were not playing by the rules. Fergie, making a speech on an American tour, was playing away.
All these men around here.
Someone called out, "I love you."
I'll see you later.
Fergie's reply was an open invitation to the media to ask any question, however personal. Once again, it was tabloid spies who caught a female royal in a compromising moment. In Fergie's case, it was her American financial advisor. Divorce from Prince Andrew would follow. The press had now identified Camilla as Charles's lover, the woman who was allegedly destroying his marriage. Camilla's husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, was doorstepped at their home, but gave nothing away.
Well, I've nothing to say, so you're wasting your time here. Thank you.
It got worse. A book was published called Diana, Her True Story, revealing her unhappy experiences as a royal and her fallout with Charles. Then intimate details of phone calls made by both Charles to Camilla and Diana to a lover were splashed across the foreign and British press. Diana was seen at a hospice in an emotional state. Another ex-lover, an army officer, James Hewitt, had sold the story of their affair. Tears and scandal were becoming regular occurrences in royal circles. And then, one shocking night, on the Queen's wedding anniversary in 1992, Windsor Castle itself caught fire. Firemen fought the blaze all night long, and as dawn broke, the Queen herself appeared, an agitated figure, pacing up and down as her beloved home went up in smoke. A whole wing of the ancient castle had been destroyed. Rooms reduced to ashes seemed a symbol of the sorry state of the House of Windsor in the final decade of the 20th century. As this awful year drew to a close, the Queen made the most candid speech of her reign.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
The press had recognized that Diana and Charles's marriage was really over when the princess, leaving her husband behind, had staged a melancholy sit-in at India's Temple of Love, the Taj Mahal. In Parliament, the Prime Minister, John Major, prepared the House for solemn news.
I wish to inform the House that Buckingham Palace are at this moment issuing the following statement. It reads as follows. It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate. Their Royal Highnesses have no plans to divorce, and their constitutional positions are unaffected. This decision has been reached amicably, and they will both continue to participate fully in the upbringing of their children.
Just 4 days later, Princess Anne would marry for a second time. Prince Charles and Andrew would not be accompanied by their estranged wives. Anne was marrying a palace equerry called Timothy Lawrence in a ceremony that was essentially private and for family only. The estranged wives, Diana and Fergie, continued to attract press attention wherever they went. It became so overpowering for Diana that she tried to withdraw from public life.
I was not aware of how overwhelming that attention would become, nor the extent to which it would affect both my public duties and my personal life in a manner that's been hard to bear. And always your love and care has eased that journey. And for that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
On the Queen's insistence, Charles and Diana would finally divorce in 1996. No longer Her Royal Highness, Diana would remain the People's Princess, using the ever-present media attention to champion even the most controversial humanitarian causes. Then came that fatal night in August 1997. Princess Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed had just left the Ritz Hotel in Paris and were speeding down a tunnel pursued by a flock of paparazzi. After the crash and the news that Diana was dead, the French public placed flowers where she'd lain. In London, long before dawn broke, thousands of people were bringing wreaths to the royal family's London home, Buckingham Palace, and to Kensington Palace, where Diana had lived. Already, people were ignorantly assuming that the royal family should be on London's streets, mixing with the masses and displaying their grief.
Well, perhaps she ought to show her sorrows about Lady Di and what a great loss it's been, you know, and as you can see, the whole world loves her.
The Queen had wanted a family funeral in which her traumatized grandsons, Princes William and Harry, would be protected from the morbid attention of strangers. Instead, she would be pressed into breaking all royal protocol, having to accept the full ceremony of a state funeral and lowering the palace flag to half-mast. It was an emotional time, but many of those who were there, with the wisdom of hindsight, would remember Diana's death as a time when the people trespassed on the royal family's private grief. There would be another sad day for the Queen only 2 months later, poignant rather than tragic, that revealed how powerful the memories of a long reigning monarch can be. The Queen and her husband Philip were saying farewell to the royal yacht Britannia, the ship that had been their floating home for nearly half a century, but was now too expensive to run. And what a cargo of sweet memories it had left them with. For a rare moment, the Queen's eyes filled with tears as the Britannia sailed out of their lives. Looking back at the high and the low points of the dying 20th century, the Queen must have wondered what had happened to respect for royalty, especially in the last decade, with its public mockery of almost everything she held dear.
Blues, 20th century blues are getting me down. Fools escape those dreary 20th century blues.
Diana's death had been a crisis point for the House of Windsor, and as the new millennium dawned, the Queen was the focus of attention and debate as to the relevance of the royal family in 21st century Britain.
20th century dear, in a strange illusion, chaos and confusion.
He's gorgeous, he's sweet, I love him.
The blues would lift, for in the year 2000, both Charles's sons made significant moves. Prince William, in his gap year, moved into the rugged mountain country of Patagonia, working with a community of international youngsters and insisting that he be treated as one of the gang. He was. They made him clean the lavatories.
Marigolds are now officially a fashion item.
Prince Harry was spotted looking smart and military as he led the Guard of Honor at his school, Eton. He looked even happier when he left school. It was a different story for the boy's great-aunt, Princess Margaret, who was in a wretched state after suffering a stroke. The Queen Mother was in better health than her daughter, who would die within a few months. Margaret would be remembered by the older generation as a woman who dazzled all who met her. She was a princess trapped by the rigid rules of her time. It was just a month later, in 2002, that the Queen Mother died, happy and vivacious to the last. She had lived a barely credible 101 years. Her funeral was a time for reflection on everything the great lady had seen and done in a remarkable life. 4 generations of Windsors attended her funeral. In the streets outside, thousands of ordinary people waited to see her coffin pass and whisper a prayer for the lady with a noble heart. The Queen summed up her mother's life with a line from a poem. You can shed tears that she has gone, or you can smile because she has lived. The Queen's only regret was that her mother had not lived to see her daughter's Golden Jubilee, which the press had predicted would be a flop. But when the 50th anniversary of her reign arrived, the cheers had never been louder, and the Golden Coach had never shone with such brilliance. The dark years of the 1990s had truly been forgotten. And what a concert Her Majesty threw in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, with the rock star Brian May from the band Queen saluting the Queen.
The Jubilee Girl is here!
And we, Your Majesty, are here tonight because, above all, we feel proud of you. Proud and grateful for everything you have done for your country and for the Commonwealth over 50 extraordinary years, supported unfailingly throughout by my father.
Three cheers for Her Majesty the Queen. Hip hip! Hip hip! Hip hip!
Days later, after his warm tribute to his mother, Charles was seen at church with Camilla, whose composure and tact were winning her public support. The couple now appeared in public frequently. They looked good together. They were clearly soulmates. Charles was playing polo again.
You forgot your boots.
Oh my God.
But this time, as part of a cunning deal he'd done with the media, to stop the press from sneaking into Prince William's 21st birthday party, Charles had offered them a day out at a polo game, featuring himself and both sons.
Bluff and double bluff, isn't it?
Okay, but I'm well surprised you scored a goal, actually. So,
Well, I can do it even at my advanced stage of decrepitude.
Both young princes had become relaxed in front of the cameras now. Indeed, Will and Harry were becoming something of a double act. Here they were stacking up aid packages for victims of the recent tsunami in Indonesia. The Queen, with her desire to uphold proper family values, had been urging Charles to marry Camilla for some time, and now it was actually happening. A private civil service wedding, followed by a blessing in St. George's Chapel, Windsor.
By thy blessing, let these rings be to Charles and Camilla, a symbol of unending love and faithfulness.
From now on, Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, would be by her husband's side on all royal occasions, as when they visited the White House to be entertained by President Bush and the First Lady.
William Wales.
And Camilla was at St. Andrews University with Charles to see William honoured with a Bachelor of Arts degree. And a few seats away, looking awfully pleased, were William's grandparents. There was a ripple of interest when this name was called out.
Catherine Middleton.
Kate was William's girlfriend. Not to be outdone, William's younger brother, Prince Harry, was at the centre of a passing-out parade at Sandhurst Military College, where Harry's grandmother, the Queen, inspected the troops. Later, Prince William would also attend Sandhurst, and that would give Second Lieutenant Harry Wales an opportunity for some fun.
For comedy value, I'll have to make a special effort to go and visit him just to get him to salute me. It would be very amusing. I would love to do that. And he's determined not to have to salute me, but well, you never know. It's the army, isn't it? You've got to do things, you know.
But Harry's mischief-making days seemed, if not over, at least on hold. Here, he was in southern Africa, following a personal impulse to help orphan kids wherever he could find them. In this, he was inspired by the memory of his mother's example, for she'd been tireless in her support for the disadvantaged before her untimely death.
But yeah, I'm only trying to highlight a problem that's going on all around the world. That's all.
On the 10th anniversary of their mother's death, William and Harry put together a programme for a remarkable charity concert featuring musicians that Diana had loved.
We wanted to represent exactly what our mother would have wanted, how she was, and we wanted to have this big concert with, you know, full of energy, full of sort of fun and happiness, which I knew she would have wanted. And on her birthday as well, it's got to be the best birthday present she's ever had. By the two of us organising it, we wanted to have the fact that the evening is all about our mother. The main purpose is to celebrate and to have fun and to remember her in a fun way.
Will we see you dancing?
I really hope not.
I hope so. Him, not me. I hope we can get a chance to see him dance.
It'll be a terrifying sight if we do, but a concertfordiana.com.
Or ring his mobile.
Or ring my
077.
no, shut up.
The concert, televised throughout the world, was a memorable and resounding birthday present for Diana from her loving sons. For the Queen, no birthday was more memorable than her 80th. With its relaxed and informal mood, Elizabeth II seemed more confident and more serene than at any time in her reign. A year later, in December 2007, aged 81, she overtook Queen Victoria, becoming the oldest reigning monarch in history. Born in 1926, she has had generations of royal example to inspire her. The iron will of her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. The love of tradition shown by her grandfather, George V, and his queen, Mary, the first Windsors. And above all, the dedication to duty of that gentle man, her father, and her indomitable mother. She has excelled them all. She has become a queen for all seasons.